Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney founded Atari Inc. in 1972, the same year in which they also found out that their original name Syzygy Co. was already registered and used in California, so they decided to choose Atari Inc. The word Atari was derived from the original word Ataru, which means meet his goals in Japanese. It derives from the historical Chinese board game Go, which Bushnell was very much into. He was generally very fond of Japanese culture and work, which influenced many of his works published to this day. The first video game commercially distributed by Atari was Pong in 1972. Bushnell visited Magnavox in 1972 and saw an interesting concept of a video tennis game which fascinated him. Shortly after returning from his visit, he gave one of his new employees the task of creating a similar video game for testing purposes. This employee was called Al Alcorn. He worked as a junior developer with two of Atari's founders at Apex before moving to Atari. He had nothing to do with video games so far, and so the task to develop Pong was his first and at the same time most famous work. Actually, no one at Atari thought that Pong would become something special, let alone commercially successful, as it was not even planned as a product to be sold in the beginning. But Al Alcorn poured months of hard work into Pong. He managed to make his game more efficient and unpredictable than the tennis games released by Magnavox. Pong's ball got faster the longer the players managed to keep the ball in play, and also bounced off the racket at different angles depending on where the ball came from. The most important thing was not the graphics or the control, but Pong was one of the first video games who had sound. At a moment's notice, digital tennis was no longer boring, but exciting and captivating. In September of 1972, Atari installed the first finished prototype of a Pong arcade machine. Equipped with a black and white screen, an orange casing and lots of solder, in a bar just around the corner of the company headquarters. Andy Tapp's Tavern. They had a good relationship with their owner Bill Geddes, and the first prototype was so well received by visitors that many visitors just simply stopped by to play without even having a drink. One of the most charming anecdotes of that time was that after a few days, Al Alcorn was sent to the bar to repair the prototype, as it suddenly stopped working. When he opened the machine, Alcorn discovered that it was not the vending machine that was broken, but only the coin pocket was so crammed full that the machine just quit. This showed Bushnell that Pong could be a success. He immediately got in touch with two companies. One was called Bally, with which Atari had already a contract for a racing game, and Midway, which should later gain great fame with the implementation of Mortal Kombat. Bushnell, however, decided against an out-of-home manufacturing of the vending machines and thought Atari could gain more prominence when acting as a manufacturer themselves. But it was not easy for an unknown video game maker to secure bank financing in 1972. Around that time frame, America was shooting heavily against the pinball vending machine business, as it was considered morally questionable and encouraging in gambling. However, they managed to secure financing through Wells Fargo, and by the end of the year they built a production line for Pong machines at their headquarters. Although the machines were slow to produce, Atari began shipping them at the end of 1972 and early 1973 all around the world. And this turned out to be a huge success. A single machine generated around $40 in one day, which is $220 in today's money. Atari got more orders than they were able to implement, and by the end of 1973 they had 2,500 machines ordered. 1974 already 8,000. In total, about 12,000 Pong machines were delivered. In the first few months after the machines were delivered, Atari employees still had to drive to the bars and pubs to pick up the sacks of coins the vending machines were making. It was customary that the shops in which the machines stood took about 50% of the profit, and the other 50% went to Atari. But Pong had two problems in the same year that it came out. The first was the massive flood of plagiarism and copies of the arcade machines that undermined the home console market, making many people even unaware of the original game, just knowing the clones. And the second problem, which should turn out to be even more serious. Pong was first registered as a patent in 1972. In America at that time, the application of patents could take several years, and Atari was not able to file claims against the manufacturers of those clone systems. But someone else could do that. Magnavox. The manufacturer and distributor of the first electronic tennis game in 1970 had secured a patent on just that. Ralph Baer persuaded his bosses to file a lawsuit against Atari, as he was sure that Bushnell had seen the game at a tennis demonstration a year earlier and had only come up with the idea of programming Pong through that. This was confirmed by a guestbook entry made by Bushnell in the year of his visit to Magnavox, which the attorneys then filed as evidence in court. But Atari was astute in the appearance and ended the proceedings out of court. The sum Atari paid Magnavox was never officially named, but should be somewhere between $400,000 and $1 million. Thus, Atari was an officially licensed owner of the right to sell player-controlled video games. Atari deftly positioned themselves in the gap between, hey, that's not my problem, we're just licensees, and hey, just buy the original Pong game, it's even better. Magnavox, however, had to spend a lot of time and money fighting the many clones the market was overrun by, whereas Atari was able to turn to new things. New variants of Pong like a 4-player Pong game, Pong sequels with different level designs, and they also planned a Pong home version. In 1974, Atari engineer Harold Lee then developed a home game variant of Pong, called Home Pong. Alcom and Lee worked on the design in duplicate, trying to eradicate one design mistake after the other. After finishing the design phase, a first prototype was made. It was wrapped in a wooden paneling and consisted for the most part, well, out of cables. These were later replaced with a specially developed chip in the later half of 1974. Now was the time to introduce Home Pong to toy and electric manufacturers.
I'm sure when you went out last week to play Pong, you got to have so much fun, you just plain forgot to come home. We all miss you, Doreen. But guess what? Atari, inventors of them electronic games put the quarters in, just made Pong for home TVs. Scorekeeping and all. Pong, invented by Atari. Now at last you can play at home. Don't, Lynn, darling, come on back home.
But they were completely uninterested in the device. Many thought it was way too expensive and that consumers were not interested in a Pong at home. Atari then contacted the Sears Sporting Goods Group and proposed a deal. They were intrigued by the idea of entering the video game market and gave an exclusive offer to Atari. After a long hesitation and some back and forth, the two bosses of Atari and Sears shook hands. Tom Quinn, head of the Sears Group, wanted to buy 150,000 home Pong devices for the upcoming Christmas season. Bushnell, who knew that Atari could only make 75,000 devices, accepted anyway and had to buy a new factory right after Sears' return, yet they managed to make 150,000 home Pong games by Christmas. These devices were named Sears Telegames. Pong did in the early 70s what mobile games are doing today. They brought video games from the dirty corner into the mainstream. They became popular and lost much of the image of gambling. However, it took another 3 years for another video game to roll over the entire market again, to overshadow everything that has been done before and brought gaming to an absolutely new level. This game was becoming the first pop culture phenomenon, and traces of its success are still evident in all areas of mobile gaming today. The inventors of the game? Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. The game? Breakout.